Hello, good afternoon, and thanks for joining this second webinar in the spring's edition of A New World, the webinar series where we at EUA are looking at global developments and their influence on higher education and research. I'm Thomas Jørgensen, and I will guide you through the state of science diplomacy here with a number of expert speakers. And I have to say that we managed to get hold of some really special people for this occasion. So it's a discussion that I'm personally looking forward to a lot. When we planned this webinar, it was on the basis of internal political discussions in Brussels. The EU member states had asked for a science diplomacy agenda in the larger context of the global approach to research and innovation. And if you want to know more about that political aspect, please go and see the first episode on the EUA YouTube channel. There's a link to your right. I'll come back to that. So it was a very internal issue. Then came the Russian attack on Ukraine, and science diplomacy has come to the fore of the public debate on research policy and also to the larger public. We've seen scientific sanctions that are arguably without precedence given the international nature of research cooperation today. And we've also seen a much more explicit call for value-based cooperation. So it's interesting times. And for that, as I said, we have invited people that are really at the center of events. We have with us Axel Leisenberg, who is working on international cooperation in research and higher education for the French ministry, and a well-known face in Brussels when talking about these issues. We also have with us Jan-Marco Müller, who is Science and Technology Advisor for the European External Action Service and a central player in the development of the European science diplomacy agenda. We also have Koen Verlaeckt, the Secretary General of the Flemish University Association VLIR. And Koen will give us the university perspective, but he also has himself extensive government experience in Flanders. So that's the program for us. Some technical issues before we start. We are being recorded, and this webinar will be put on the EUA YouTube channel. For the platform, you are welcome to ask questions to all of us all the time. Please use the Q&A tab for this to your right. There you'd also be able to see questions posed by other in the audience, and you can vote for questions that you find particularly interesting, which is very helpful for us because then we know if many of you ask which are the more important questions. There is a handout session if you want to watch other videos from this series or have more information, for instance, about the war in Ukraine and the initiative taken by universities or central EU documents from the member states and from the Commission about this. But before we come so far, we'd like to have a small poll to see particularly how the war in Ukraine changed, and if it has changed, your view on international cooperation. So you should see that now. Has the war in Ukraine changed your views on international cooperation in research and higher education? Yes, to some extent, or no, not at all. So let's see how that unfolds, and you can do that under polls on your right side. So we have about 2/3, a little less maybe, saying this has changed the view on international cooperation, but perhaps not radically, to some extent. A third saying yes, this has changed, and a small but noticeable minority saying no, this has actually not changed how we think. So that's maybe a cue to our speakers. There is a change, but it's maybe not a sea change. It's maybe not a completely radical change in the way we look at things. So many thanks for answering to that poll, and I'll give the word to our first speaker, Axel Leisenberg, about how the French presidency, the EU, the member states largely see science diplomacy. Please, Axel, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and good afternoon to everybody. It is really a pleasure to be a part of this webinar. Thank you very much for the invitation. And indeed, it is, I think, a very timely a topic that we are going to discuss this afternoon, as of course, when dealing with international cooperation in research and innovation and higher education, of course, geopolitical developments, the geopolitical context can change rapidly a lot in our cooperation, on how we are dealing with our cooperation. In my presentation today, I want to give an update actually on the priorities of the French presidency of the Council of the European Union that runs until the 30th of June, so 1.5 months to go, and especially want to focus, of course, on the priority on international cooperation in research and innovation. That is one of the priorities of our presidency. The program, of course, was established before the Russian attack on Ukraine, but it goes without saying that, of course, it deeply has affected the program, but also, of course, the action during our presidency in the field of higher education, research, and innovation, especially regarding this priority, international cooperation, with the question that come up on how what are the consequences from the Russian aggression in Ukraine? What will be the consequences on the cooperation with this country, but also what will be the consequences for researchers at risk, for example, in Ukraine, but also in other countries, researchers and students, of course. One characteristic of international cooperation policies is that its design and implementation depends also on the coordination between the EU and the member states level. This is why in the second part of my presentation, I will also focus on this issue, also in my capacity as the member states co-chair of the ERA Forum's Global Approach group that was established only a couple of weeks ago, but I will come back to this. I will then start with just an overview of the thematic objectives in the field of higher education, research and innovation of the French presidency of the Council of the European Union. You see on the left-hand side the keywords of the presidency that are recovery, strength, and the sense of belonging. And yes, on the right-hand side, you see what we have made out of these three keywords. One of the priorities is to promote the synergies between higher education, research, innovation, and services to society. The second is already the topic on international cooperation, structuring the international dimension of European higher education, research, and innovation policies. But I also want to mention the other priorities that are developing a sense of European identity and deepen the reflection on open science. But coming back to international cooperation, so the structuring of the international dimension of European higher education, research and innovation policies. Here, the objective of the presidency, once again, it was designed before the Russian aggression in Ukraine. The objective is to highlight the benefits of international cooperation in research and innovation, and the presidency wants to strive to promote a balanced cooperation with non-EU countries, and it will underscore the need to uphold the EU's values and interests, as well as the requirements for global standards, in particular for intellectual property, but also for open science, in order to assert the EU's role as a driving force and initiator of these standards. And I think this is already part of the concept that we call science diplomacy. What we have done with this priority, you see it on this slide. I want to highlight here that the priority very much integrates the European policy agenda, and it is part of a revitalized debate on the EU strategy for international cooperation in research and innovation, but also in higher education. You see here the first point is now 1 year ago, the publication of a new strategy from the European Commission that is also in the hands-out session. It is the global approach to research and innovation. This was really the start of our reflections as a presidency, what we can make out of it, as we believe that we need to strive for mutual beneficial partnerships to rebalance cooperation based on a level playing field and of reciprocity, and mainly also to base our cooperation on shared values and principles. And there you see already that, of course, the war in Ukraine could have immediate effects on what we are going on, the way we are going to cooperate with such a country. We then, as member states in the council, responded to this new strategy with the council conclusions of the 28th of September last year. And one of the points was that we asked ourselves, the member states, but also to the Commission, to develop on the values and principles for international cooperation in order to promote them in a multilateral dialogue on these values and principles. I also want to mention the strategy from the European Commission that was published in January on a new strategy for universities that also contains a part on international cooperation or the outreach of universities, also to promote values of higher education, research and innovation, but also more generally democratic values. And then now I come to the main part of what we did in our presidency. This was the Marseille Ministerial Conference on a global approach to research, innovation and higher education on the 8th of March, just a couple of days after the start of the war in Ukraine. So what have been the objectives of our ministerial conference? It was to facilitate the discussions between the member states to agree actually on the key principles and values of international cooperation. This was what the member states asked to do in September 2021. And it was also to underline the orientations of the Union's policy on cooperation with third countries. One of the main outcome then that I really want to highlight here is the Marseille Declaration. What is it? So we had a ministerial debate on principles and values for international cooperation, and as a French presidency, we launched this Marseille Declaration on international cooperation in research and innovation. It contains 9 principles and values that we believe, as the French presidency, should be the basis for balanced and mutual beneficial cooperation in research and innovation. So you see it here on the left-hand side. This declaration provides a framework for the future for fair, open, inclusive, participatory science that works for the common good, which will form the basis for dialogue with non-EU countries. So you find here different values and principles. Of course, we did not start from scratch, and we did not work alone in order to prepare this document, but these values and principles, of course, also come out from previous works of the Council, especially the Pact for Research and Innovation that was adopted by the member states in late 2021. And then we also work together with the Commission and member states in order to to transfer these values and principles to the cooperation in the context of international partnerships. You find, of course, values that are fundamental for cooperation, as we believe, in order to provide a safe environment for our researchers and our teachers to work on the international level, to provide them the best working conditions in order to fulfill their missions as researchers, as teachers, as students, and so on, as academics in the global way. Of course, freedom of scientific research, as mentioned, is one of the main values and principles, but you will also find here ethics and integrity, excellence in research, and so on. Principles like open science, intellectual property, but also risk management and security issues, as I mentioned, as our mission is to provide the safe environment for our academics. This conference also provided the opportunity for the ministers to discuss in 3 thematic workshops on specific issues. You will find here science diplomacy as one of the specific issues, but I also want to highlight that, of course, when the ministers talked about the global outreach of European University Alliance, or even on cooperation with Africa in higher education, research and innovation, of course, the dimension of science diplomacy and the power of science diplomacy in these dimensions has to be highlighted. For example, on the global outreach of European University Alliance, of course, they are kind of a mean to make our European universities more visible and more attractive at the international level. They are also a promoter of our values and principles. So they are really an important part of science diplomacy, and they provide, in this respect, added value as a vector for the dissemination of our values even beyond the borders of Europe. Well, what comes next after this conference, also within the respect of the French presidency of the Council of the EU? As I said, the Marseille Declaration was an initiative of the French presidency. It was welcomed by the member state representatives during the conference, but still it is a paper that was published by the French ministry. So in order to be formally endorsed, we now are seeking the council. We are asking the council to make council conclusions on these values and principles, on the text of these values and principles. And these are expected to be adopted during the next meeting of research and innovation ministers in the Council of the European Union on the 10th of June. On the basis of these principles and values that I have mentioned before, also with respect to the Commission strategy on the global approach and the Council conclusions of September, there will be the launch of a multilateral dialogue on principles and values in international R&I cooperation that will be conducted by the European Commission. And yes, it is important to highlight it because we do not only want to define our values and principles, but we also want and we also need to promote them at international level in order to provide a safe environment for our researchers, teachers, students, academics, and so on in this respect. I said before ending that I wanted to come back to the need for coordination between the EU and member states in international research and innovation cooperation, and within the new governance structure of the European research area. There is now one specific subgroup as a Commission informal expert group that is dealing with international cooperation. It is called the Standing Subgroup on the Global Approach to Research and Innovation within the governance structure of the European Research Area Forum. And this new subgroup that is co-chaired by the member states and by the Commission, we are dealing with specific topics that are of course linked to international cooperation. And of course, the main item that is of interest here is the advice that will be given on the development of a European science diplomacy agenda. But I believe that in the next speech there will be more information on this. I just wanted to highlight also other initiatives on international cooperation that might be of interest. And this is, of course, this multilateral dialogue on values and principles that I've mentioned before, but also pilot initiatives based on the Team Europe approach. So member states and the European Commission working together on specific topics and with specific objectives with regards to third countries. And here we will mostly work on two pilot initiatives on Africa and also on China. We also will work on a more coordinated approach to engagement in multilateral initiatives. This is another point that was highlighted in the Global Approach to Research and Innovation strategy of last year. And then monitoring and implementation, of course, will be another part of the work in this group. Last but not least, I want to say that it is informal Commission group, but stakeholders and stakeholder organizations are part of it actually as observers and take part in these discussions. And I think this is something that is very important when we are talking about international cooperation. We in research and innovation, we can talk about designing and implementing it at policy level, but actually the main work on international cooperation is conducted by our researchers, our students and teachers and so on. And this is why I believe it is very important that they are part of the discussion as well. I will leave it here so far. Please do not hesitate if you have any questions, and thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Axel. I think just to sum it up, I think what is fascinating here is that we have this ongoing process of setting a common European framework for international cooperation. And you really have the member states and the governments, you have the Commission, you have the stakeholders that coordinate this, and those of us that are in Brussels know that it is really a big process to coordinate and agree and set up this framework, these values, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. And please, if you have any questions, they can be practical. When is this going to happen? I would like to hear more about something that came up in the speech. There is on your right side the Q&A tab. You press on that and you ask the question, and then we can come back to that after the speakers. But before we get that far, I want to give the word to Jan Marco Müller, who is, I think, without exaggeration, a science diplomacy veteran.
Yes, thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you for the invitation. I haven't prepared any slides because in the environment I'm working in, usually by the time I get to preparing the last slide, the first one is already outdated. So let me say a few words about science diplomacy. Science diplomacy as a concept, as a term, has become very fashionable in the last, say, 10 to 15 years or so. Of course, science activities which we could call science diplomacy have been long existed before that, but I mean the concept as such surfaced in the last 15 years or so, with several member states having developed science diplomacy strategies. We've seen several foreign ministries having established functions of science advisors or science diplomacy coordinators. Science diplomacy suddenly popped up on the organigrams of research ministries. So there was a lot of dynamic in this, and on the European level, you perhaps will know that there were 3 science diplomacy projects funded by Horizon 2020, which have also advanced conceptually and methodologically. The concept also have developed training materials and this sort of things. And there's now a network which is called the EU Science Diplomacy Alliance, which is a kind of the legacy, the platform building on these projects, which gathers the science diplomacy community. And if you look at different recent policy communications coming from the EU, you will see the fingerprints of science diplomacy, so to speak, in the global approach to research and innovation, which Axel mentioned. So that's just the international science strategy of the EU. You see it in the European University strategy, of course, also in the Marseille Declaration Axel just mentioned. And last September, the member states, in their opinion on this global approach, they actually asked the Commission and the European External Action Service to develop a European science diplomacy agenda. And one can say that initially in the first year, say up to 2016, more or less, that was, the honeymoon phase of science diplomacy, where everything was, be open to the world and be nice to each other and everything science can do and so on. And we have entered gradually into what some call now the post-naive science diplomacy phase, which actually didn't start with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but we have seen in last years more and more debate about foreign interference in research policies, about theft of intellectual property, of reciprocity, and all these issues which you actually also can read in the global approach, and of course the issues around values and academic freedom. This brings me perhaps to the definition of science diplomacy. Of course, there's these famous 3 strands, and I think Koen will talk about it in his presentation. So diplomacy for science and science for diplomacy and so on. So I will not dwell on this. But actually, at the very bottom of it is the purpose of science diplomacy is basically to use science or scientific knowledge more generally to advance diplomatic goals. And diplomatic goals, they can be national goals, there can be European goals, there can be global goals like the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance. So that's actually the ultimate purpose of science diplomacy. And of course, diplomatic goals, they are not always nice. They can involve sanctions, as we have seen, and other issues. So science diplomacy is not just for sunny days, as perhaps some initially thought, but actually it is much more multifaceted. So the kind of learning curve we are having now with science diplomacy is actually that we are having a kind of training in realpolitik, so to speak. That there are not only nice guys out there. There's, of course, the whole issue around anti-science, disinformation, decay of truth, and all these issues that all come into play here. And in a way, this Russian invasion in Ukraine has put this on a new level, adding much more, let's say, complexity, severeness, urgency to it. And we have seen, as you mentioned, Thomas, sanctions regimes that involve science as well. Interestingly enough, many of these sanctions actually self-imposed. So universities saying, I'm not going to work with that university that has signed this rector statement in Russia, for instance, which actually shows that, say, the independence and self-governance of science also works there, but actually a step which we haven't seen before. We are having, of course, we are seeing the consequences of the war in Ukraine, so the destruction of facilities in Ukraine, the refugee scientists, and the big outpour of solidarity of scientists in Europe for their Ukrainian colleagues. We are seeing the impacts on Russian science, which is we see with brain drain, with IT people leaving Russia, with Russian people due to sanctions and isolation not being able to get equipment, not being able to travel. And of course, this will result in a loss of excellence of Russian science, but we also see global consequences. So consequences for international research infrastructure where Russia is or was participating, consequences for issues, for instance, Arctic research, which is difficult to imagine without Russia. So there are all these consequences. But on the other side, of course, also science has consequences on diplomacy, the technology development, which is advancing at very high speed. Think of artificial intelligence, think of quantum technologies and how they are going to shift balances of power in the world. See, of course, the COVID-19 vaccines, and which were developed in less than a year, and see all the kind of vaccine diplomacies and geopolitical games that have been done with these vaccines. So there is actually need for science and diplomacy to talk to each other, and the European science diplomacy agenda will be one tool to kind of outline a chart of what should be happening. And for me, I think that the main priorities I would see in the context of such a European science diplomacy agenda, there's first of all, of course, how to embed this global approach to research innovation in the foreign and security policies, the issues around values we have been talking about, including, for instance, ethics, which is actually one area where the European approach differs from the Chinese and the US-American approach, because we think about ethics of technologies much more than some other countries, which sometimes we are criticized for being a risk-averse continent, but actually that's part of having this broader societal debate. The issue around how can we use science much more strategically in our diplomatic toolbox, so to speak. Think of the crisis of multilateralism, and science, of course, being a natural ally for multilateralism. Think of the discussions we're having about strategic autonomy of Europe and what role science and technology plays in this context. Then, of course, the issue of tackling global challenges. What is going to come after the Sustainable Development Goals, which to some degree have been derailed by COVID and by the invasion of Russia? Think of the green and digital transitions and all these challenges we have. Think of the militarization, politicization, commercialization of the global commons, like oceans, outer space, the Arctic. So they're very, very huge questions we need to tackle. And then, of course, in a more practical sense, how can we create these interlinkages between science and diplomacy to talk to each other? So they'll be talking about training and capacity building of both scientists and diplomats, of how to create, let's say, science advisory ecosystems for foreign and security policies. But also how to strengthen the demand side, because science diplomacy so far has been very often supply side driven and science saying what they can do, but actually we need the diplomats to ask questions to us. And then, of course, ultimately, of course, the issue around member states and EU level. So how to find synergies between member states' approaches, define EU added value, and create mechanisms to work together. And that's kind of, say, a train that is starting now. There's been some delay because work that has been ongoing in council, but of course also the Marseille conference we've been waiting for. And in a way, this delay has been useful because now obviously we live in a different world and we need to factor in all these issues. So just to finish my intervention, of course, universities play a key role in all of this because universities provide evidence for diplomats. Because let's not forget, at the end of the day, It's diplomats that negotiate climate agreements. It's not scientists. So they rely on input from the scientists. Universities play a key role in advancing, let's say, the concepts of science diplomacy, but also they play a very important role as civil society actors. And that's becomes very important, of course, now in the context also of Russia, where institutions don't talk to each other anymore. Of course, there will be much more focus on people-to-people interactions. So perhaps so far my few thoughts on this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think a lot of things, a lot of unanswered questions, and I think again we are in a process to define, what is Europe going to do? What is the European science diplomacy way? But I think keeping the concepts you had about post-naive science diplomacy is something definitely to keep in mind also for our discussion. But I will now go to Koen to see a little bit of examples, a little bit of definitions, and a little bit of examples on what goes on the ground. So please, Koen.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and many thanks also to Axel and to Jan Marco for setting the scene on this very, very interesting and challenging topic called science diplomacy. Jan Marco, you said that you didn't have the time to prepare slides, or I should phrase it in another way, that tradition has learned you not to prepare too many slideshows beforehand, because things are moving very, very quickly. But you already referred to through the three so-called strands of science diplomacy. I'm not going to go into detail, but they date back to 2010, a report which was then published by the Royal Society and the AAAS. Where you have different sub-strands or different sub-concepts of science diplomacy called diplomacy for science, science for diplomacy, science in diplomacy. The one message which I want to share with you on this topic is that if you present a politician, a member of government, with these three different strands, they don't understand what it's all about. So it's really, really important to have a pragmatic approach to science diplomacy. This all sounds very nice, and I fully understand from an academic point of view, from a conceptual point of view. But we should make sure that if we want to advance the agenda of science diplomacy with our political masters, that we speak in as simple language as possible. I took a quote also from the website, Jan Marco, of the External Action Service, which says science diplomacy eludes an agreed definition. And then you have these three strands, which are also mentioned explicitly on the website. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the concept of science diplomacy. The previous speakers have already lined out that it's a top priority at the moment in Europe's international R&D policy. We have Axel pointed out the different policy documents, the revised global R&D policy framework, the whole new European research area, and then also the Marseille Declaration and the link to everything which relates to unwanted foreign direct interference in academic activities. So I guess this is all information which is well known to all the participants. I think that it's important to ask ourselves the question whether science diplomacy is more than what I would call repackaging existing actions. I make reference to a publication by Tim Flink, published in Science and Public Policy this year, where he clearly lines out the history of science diplomacy. As Jan Marco already said, a concept which has been very successfully branded over the last 10 to 15 years. It has been used for very many heterogeneous goals. You see them listed here on the slide, but there are many others. For example, issues about purely marketing the R&D system or marketing higher education institutes of a certain country. It has been used as soft power. It has also been put forward as a mechanism to help tackle worldwide challenges and so forth. So you see the list here, and there are many more goals, I think, which have been used over the last couple of years. I wanted to share with you some personal observations. Let me be very clear about that. Not to destroy the concept of science diplomacy, because it's a very good concept. But I think that by developing a separate science diplomacy agenda, and once again, I have in the back of my mind the way that politicians are looking at science diplomacy, is that it risks, if you do it in the wrong way, it risks to be something highly artificial. If you look at typical policy letters which are produced by ministries, then you basically, science diplomacy becomes a little bit cherry picking from different policy letters. For example, policy letter on higher education, policy letter on science, policy letter on foreign policy, where you take away little bits and pieces and you repackage them under the name of science diplomacy. So you have to be very careful that you do not cut the links which exist with other elements in those specific, I would call it, thematic policy areas like research, higher education, foreign policy, and probably also many others. At the same time, I think it's also crucial to say that developing such a separate SD agenda can be highly beneficial and is very beneficial in drawing and in pooling resources from different policy domains. If I started talking with my minister in the government many years ago about science diplomacy, I can say to you that the first reaction was, this sounds really like a very sexy concept. We should do something about it, and we are going to make sure that we have specific resources devoted for some actions. Seen from a university perspective, that's a second observation which I wanted to share with you, is that it's so crucial, this intertwining of research and higher education, that one could basically also question the adequacy of the term science diplomacy. So and this is a point which is also referred to in the Marseille Declaration, the need for a holistic approach, where you really have to make a focus on science and higher education. Because if you isolate science, I'm not saying that this is the intention, but if you look at the global R&D policy, for example, of the European Commission, higher education is absolutely lacking. It's mentioned a couple of times in the text, but it's not the first scope of the document. And I strongly believe that if you develop a science policy agenda, a science diplomacy agenda, or a knowledge diplomacy agenda, or whatever term you want to use, please make sure that you do not forget about the higher education component. Third point, it's not rocket science, but it's, I think, good that we realize from time to time that diplomacy is no longer the exclusive remit of governments. There were times when diplomats were people working for governments and only for governments. Things have changed. You see, for example, a whole series of new diplomatic actors who have emerged, including regions. I'm talking to you from Flanders, the northern part of Belgium, a devolved region with highly devolved responsibilities also in the field of foreign policy, but that's a different story. But you see, for example, also cities, you see ports, you see universities, you see public research institutes who set up their own diplomatic agenda. You see them going on missions abroad to promote their assets. So the landscape of diplomacy has become much wider, much broader, much more interesting, but at the same time also much more challenging in trying to keep an overview about what's going on, and also much more challenging in terms of trying to link together the agendas where there is an added value of so many different and very heterogeneous players. Final point which I wanted to make, or a final reflection which I wanted to share, is that when we develop a science diplomacy agenda or an agenda for science and higher education diplomacy, as it is foreseen in the new European research area, I think it's crucial that all the actors of the quintuple innovation helix are being taken into account. So it must be more than only universities and government talking to each other. I'm not saying that that is the intention, but I would be very much interested to hear maybe at a later moment from some of the other speakers to see how this challenge is being taken up, because I think that also the dimensions of civil society, the public at large, and environment are really absolutely crucial to take those on board when developing such a diplomatic agenda. A couple of examples from a sub-state actor like Flanders. How do we see knowledge? I've called it here knowledge diplomacy. Sorry, it could have been science diplomacy or science and higher education, but I'm not going to reiterate that on every slide. But I've tried to bring together some purely practical examples about what we are trying to do, both from a government perspective and from the perspective of universities, and more specifically from my organization, which is basically the National Rectors Conference of Flanders. So, for example, one of the things which we are seeing is a very active involvement of higher education institutions in outgoing official missions. This does not happen in all member states. We have two types of very official missions. We've got the royal state visits, where the focus really is about promotion and visibility of the academic assets, in this case, not only of Flanders, but also of Wallonia under the umbrella of Belgium. At the same time, we also have economic trade missions, where the focus is much broader. It's of course also about promotion and visibility, but it's about prospecting new partnership opportunities. It's about trying to attract students and staff. There is a very important element of networking with alumni who are residing in the country or in the city that's being visited. And there is, of course, also scope for new cooperation agreements and reinforcing and deepening of existing ties. So this is one type of activity, or two subtypes, if you want, of activity, which are really part of our knowledge diplomacy in Flanders. Another one, and quite an interesting one, a very new scheme. It's called the FAYA Fellowship Program. It was approved by the government only a couple of months ago. It's intended for Flemish students wishing to pursue their studies at a top university abroad. I'm not going to bother you with the details about how those students are being selected or which universities, but it's basically using the international QS ranking. But in contra, you have the traditional fellowship programs, which we are all aware of. But the very specific thing, or the very challenging thing about this one, is that it's a program which is funded by the Flemish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's not a program funded by the Ministry of Education, nor is it a program funded by the Science Ministry. It's funded by Foreign Affairs. And the basic intention is that students, of course, are expected to pursue their studies abroad, but at the same time, they also need to integrate in the existing local networks, economic networks, diplomatic networks, you call it, and to serve also as public ambassadors for their region when they are pursuing these studies, or when they are using these fellowships. Another example is our diplomatic academy, something which started only last month, if I'm not mistaken, where basically our regional diplomats and from different ministries, we've got the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we've got the Foreign Trade Agency and the Tourism Agency are trained and get courses from top academics based in Flanders, in Belgium, but also with external experts. The basic idea is there to professionalize our diplomats and to make sure that they also start to speak and learn to speak the language of science and scientists, so that they are better trained to spot opportunities, for example, to further either scientific or diplomatic objectives. Another example is everything which has to do with the international branding of our region under the umbrella Flanders State of the Art. We've seen over the last couple of years 3 phases. First phase was very much focused on the cultural icons of the past and basically what we call our Flemish masters. Whatever museum you visit across the world, you will also have, you will always have a gallery with, we call it Flemish masters, but in most museums it's called Dutch masters, but that's a definition or a discussion on itself. Focus on Bruegel, Van Eyck and Rubens. In phase 2, a couple of years later, the focus has been put on modern masters. So for example, our master chefs, gastronomy, but also people working in design or fashion icons. And the interesting thing is that at this moment, as we speak, there is a 3rd phase under development where the government also wants to include scientific masters. So scientists from the past who really have made a difference and who are going to be actively used in the international branding of our region. A last thing is that we have, from the perspective of universities, we have put a very strong focus on values already for quite some time, and we strongly believe in the importance of bottom-up initiatives by universities themselves. Because we see that the moment there are incidents, for example, that government officials, that ministers often have the intention to say, well, let's stop cooperation with country X or Y because there has been a major incident. We've seen it with Russia, we've seen it with China in the past. And there is, of course, this sense of urgency, which is really pushing politicians forward. It's the pressure of parliament, it's the pressure of the press, and so forth. So we as universities think it's absolutely crucial to work on the basis of a lot of self-regulation. So we have developed at the level of VLIR, our National Rectors Conference, we have developed a human rights assessment tool, which allows researchers basically to see whether, when they are planning to engage in a new partnership with new people abroad, to check whether there are risks for human rights violation. We've developed guidelines for researchers on dual use and misuse of research. We've done a training tool on scientific integrity, and we are also contributing to host scholars at risk. Final thing which I wanted to share here is that in this whole discussion about values, but also about knowledge security and everything which is related to that, the idea of tackling unwanted foreign direct interference, we really feel that it's important for government actors to become true partners of universities and other public knowledge institutes. And the first thing we need governments for is to provide universities with what I would call strategic intelligence on partners abroad, on countries abroad, on politics abroad, to help us make the right decisions. And I think that here, of course, national security is still an issue and a responsibility of the member states, but we see that there are many different actors. Only in the Belgian context, we see levels at the federal level and at the actors at the federal level and the regional level. But I think there is also a role to play there for the External Action Service and for other actors at the European level who sit on the top of information, of strategic intelligence, where universities are really looking forward to have a first point of contact on behalf of all those intelligence services or foreign services to help them to assess risks involved in international cooperation. And that would be a very complementary instrument to what we are trying to do bottom up through self-regulation as universities ourselves. So these were a couple of things which I wanted to share with all of you. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks, Koen. Both a political and practical message, what is done and what should be done. We do have time for a couple of questions, and I'll try, because there are quite a few here on the side. So I'll try to put them a little bit together, and I think there are two that go in the same direction. one from the Polish National Agency for Academic Exchange, saying what kind of solidarity can we hope for to deal with Russian universities in the light of the war in Ukraine. And another one from Philippe Terhegen that goes in another direction, saying, yes, there is broad consensus, I would say, about this solidarity. But we also need Russian expertise, and Jan Marco, for instance, mentioned the Arctic, but we could mention space as well. I think what's interesting here is the trade-offs. We all agree on the solidarity, but it comes with trade-offs. So it becomes, at least in my view, a very political decision rather than a sort of black-white rational decision. But maybe, Jan Marco, these trade-offs, can you say something about that?
That's, of course, the million-euro question, how to deal with it. Of course, the challenge we have is that universities and research institutes, they are closely intertwined with the Russian state. Yeah? And we cannot have a cooperation with a university whose rector is justifying the invasion in Ukraine. It's quite simply is not possible. Okay, let's be clear about it. On the other side, of course, there is also the other Russia we shouldn't forget. Yeah, there are the 8,000 scientists that have signed the declaration against the war. There are also some statements from the Russian side. If you look at the statement which was done by the Russian Academy of Sciences, which was much more nuanced. Yeah, you see that, of course, there is dictate from the Kremlin, but there's also, another Russia there. But of course, the difficulty is we cannot kind of formally engage with them because the institutions are part of the Russian state. So that's why it is important to have these people-to-people conversations. And I think scientists will know best whether they can trust the counterpart they've worked for many years in Russia with. And of course, we should not put them into danger. That's another issue, which is a bit tricky, of course. On the other side, I also think it is necessary that we keep at least some spaces, let's say, plant the seeds for the post-war future, for the future trust building. And there, of course, some of these international infrastructures, like the International Space Station, where this cooperation is still ongoing, like the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, ITER, which is ongoing. And we'll also see in the latest sanction package, actually, there have been some exemptions for nuclear fusion cooperation, for space cooperation, for nuclear safety cooperation. So I think there will be a few channels that we need to keep open. We cannot, of course, formally engage with the Russian state institution. That's very clear. But I think that's why it is so important that actually the individual scientists, and they will know best whether their moral compass, so to speak, allows to engage with the Russian counterpart. But of course, it is definitely, a big problem we have, especially for the global challenge research, for climate research, for Arctic research, etc. And I don't have an easy solution for that.
No, that is the nature of trade-offs, that there are rarely easy solutions. And I think what you point to, the fact that much of the science cooperation with Russia has been dependent on big infrastructures, makes it particularly difficult because your people-to-people contact depends on that. There are a couple of questions, maybe more for Axel on the process, and I think Koen also alluded to this in terms of the voices of students and early career researchers, so PhD candidates, but maybe also how do we know that it works? A question saying, is there do we have evidence-based initiatives about science diplomacy? Can you talk a little bit more about the sort of inclusiveness of the process, and maybe also what is the evidence that this is built on?
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, as I said also in my presentation, our work at a policymaker level, at the ministry level, is to provide our researchers that are working internationally with the best working conditions possible, and this includes that we have to strive for global standards, and that we cannot accept, for example, that research, the liberty of academic research is threatened in a specific country, or even that there are foreign interferences that hinder our researchers to work very good or in good conditions together. And of course, this especially focuses also on young researchers. So it is very important also to have the voice of researchers in general, but also from the young researchers community in the designing of this policy. So, for example, in preparation of the Marseille Declaration, we also had stakeholder consultations in which stakeholder umbrella organizations participated within the new era form subgroup. This is a very technical working group, but however, it is open also for stakeholders to participate. And stakeholder organizations participate, and I really encourage also to stakeholders, and especially also individuals, researchers and young researchers, to participate in the discussions. And it's the same for the multilateral dialogue that will be launched, where also, of course, the voices of those who are actually making happen international cooperation, research, and innovation do participate not only on the side event, but also in the design of the policies. Regarding the question on the evidence-based, on evidence on science diplomacies in member states, first of all, of course, science diplomacy is mainly conducted by member states within their large networks of embassies and actions and structures that they have. Within the former group that does not exist anymore, that is called the Strategic Forum for International S&T Cooperation, we had a specific working group on science diplomacy with a survey that was sent out to all the member states in order to have a clearer view of their policies, their strategies, and their actions in science diplomacy. And the report that came out of this working group is also published. I can look for a link to this paper in order to provide you this information.
Excellent. Many thanks. It's true. Early stage researchers are often the glue of international cooperation. There's one last question that has topped the chart here from Albert Gaunt in Sweden. Who asked, and I think I'll just let Koen kick off with this one, but the other ones you can answer as well. Is there not a risk of instrumentalisation? Are there instances where the use of science diplomacy would not be in interest of universities and researchers? And I know, Jan Marco, you said a little bit to this, and I cannot help myself to say the current blocking of Horizon Europe Association for the UK would be a case where it's certainly not in the interest of the research community. But we will not open that can of worm. Koen, how does this look from your universities? Is there a danger of being instrumentalized?
Well, it depends a little bit on the way you look at it, but if I go back to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, for example, you had a very quick reaction from our Minister of Education, for example, who said, I don't want any Russian students any longer in Flanders. That was not a very okay. It was a statement which was made in the press. It was not very nuanced, but the basic image created a panic reaction within the community of Russian students who are at the moment studying in Flemish universities. I think it's really crucial to keep open what I call the lifeline, the academic lifeline, and preserve the personal contacts, not only at the level of scientists, and a lot of good solidarity measures have already been taken and put in place but I think it's also absolutely crucial to do it for students. If we see what happens with researchers, for example, we have very good organizations like Scholars at Risk. We've got the European Commission scheme for Ukrainian researchers, but I would very strongly advocate to have something similar, Students at Risk like mechanism, as it exists already in a couple of member states. If I'm not mistaken, it exists in Norway, in Poland, and in Germany, very specific programs, and I think there is also a need to do something at the European scale, not only for students from Russia, but from students from all countries who are being persecuted within their country, and where the basic philosophy is that you cannot punish a student because he or she is a national citizen of country X or country Y. It's a completely different ballgame if you're talking about bilateral institutional frameworks and bilateral agreements which are being made with institutions where, for example, a rector say, I endorses the policy of the government, and this is deemed to be a wrong policy in our sense. So, but we should also do something about students. That's my strong belief.
Okay, thanks very much. We're coming to an end. Jan-Marco or Axel, do you want to come in on this? Because you might be the ones that are seen as instrumentalizing universities. Jan-Marco, you've unmuted yourself. I'm sure you have something to say.
There are always two here. One who instrumentalizes and one who lets him or herself being instrumentalized. No, I mean, to give you an example, I started my current job on the 1st of August 2020. And 10 days later, Mr. Putin announced Sputnik V as the first vaccine against COVID-19. And when I heard this, I had two reactions. The first one was, great. Russia has 150 years of experience in vaccine research. I had no doubt that this is a serious effort to have a vaccine against COVID. But the second reaction was, this was a PR stunt, approving vaccines before even going into phase 3 clinical trials. And this is going to ruin the reputation of these vaccines, no matter how effective it's going to be. And that's exactly what happened, because of being instrumentalized politically.
Great, very good example. Axel, do you want to come in on this?
Very shortly, maybe just saying that, of course, in a changing geopolitical context, with all the consequences, tragical consequences that we see right now, I think public authorities also have the responsibility to prevent instrumentalization, of course, within the respect of institutional autonomy. But I think orientation should be given within this respect, also on what are the risks that might be inherent to international cooperation in research and innovation. I think, yes, it was mentioned, this post-naive era maybe of science diplomacy has started now. And indeed, within this context, we need to avoid any instrumentalization of our higher education institutions and research organizations.
Thank you very much. And I think this brings us to the end of our webinar. Many thanks to the speakers. Many thanks to the audience, all the good questions, all the greetings in the chat. Particular thanks for those many of you who joined from Ukraine. I think I can say surely our thoughts is with you all the time. We will continue this discussion, science diplomacy in a post-naive era, or whatever headline we will put it under. We will also continue the series with a last installment on the 14th of June, looking at the future of higher education in the light of the new policies that have been developed by UNESCO in the Big World Higher Education Conference that was held last week in Barcelona. Another big discussion, another interesting topic. I hope you will join us. But for now, I want to say goodbye and thanks again to everybody.